out of here, sir.
Why?
This is about people's rights to be human.
In his latest book, British author Douglas Murray offers his take on a dark splinter that's been lodged in the flesh of mankind throughout world history. That being, as the title of the 2019 work implies, the madness of crowds.
Every day there's a new victim who the crowd can pile onto for wrongthink. I don't myself enjoy watching this, even when the people who the crowd is piling onto are people who I disagree with.
This madness, seen manifested to deadly effect on the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary France in the U.S. treatment of American Indians.
They were led out of the prison compound. They were shackled and chained together. They had hoods on them. The women began wailing and weeping. One of the prisoners in a loud voice said, "Namach umpo metakwepi, hear me my people. Today is not a day of defeat. It is a day of victory. For we have made our peace with our Creator. We now go to be with Him forever."
Japanese Americans.
February 19th, 1942, FDR issued Executive Order 9066, which led to the forced relocation of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. They were confined to internment camps operated by the military. More than two-thirds of these people were native-born American citizens. Abruptly forced to abandon or sell their homes and businesses, many lost everything that they owned.
In Hitlerian Germany,
שבין ה-15 במאי ל-9 ביולי 1944 גורשו כ-437,000 מיהודי הונגריה רבתי, רובם מערי השדה, למחנה אושוויץ-בירקנאו. הם גורשו מ-55 גטאות ומקומות ריכוז גדולים ב-147 רכבות מסע. רובם נרצחו בתאי הגזים בבירקנאו מיד לאחר הגעתם למחנה.
Vichy France, the USSR, Communist China, North Korea, and to large and small degrees in Britain, Canada, Australia, and in other horrific atrocities such as lynch mobs in the United States, has, it seems, always been connected to a dangerous, errant circuit in the human mind. More to the point, it's always been a bleak and poisonous threat to the human soul.
You are disgusting.
Why?
You're a fucking human.
What have I done?
The recent shocking displays of uninformed mass aggression against peaceful Canadian YouTuber Dan Dix on the streets of Vancouver are stark reminders of this madness. First, Dan, a man who opposes government oppression and has produced powerful videos documenting the antagonistic, corrupt action of police and politicians, on May 31st was surrounded in downtown Vancouver as he peacefully recorded a Black Lives Matter march. Fingered as an outlier, a nonconformist, and mistakenly, unethically labeled a racist and a fascist, both mindsets he has consistently opposed and worked very hard to fight, Dan found himself the target of yelling, blocking, shoving, potential property damage, physical assault, and verbal threats that increased as the seconds passed.
So what again have I done or said that you guys have a problem with?
You have a history of putting people's information.
What have I done or said that you have a problem with?
You have a history of putting information of people on hate sites.
Like what? Like what?
Like the personal information for people who attack.
I've never done that.
Yeah.
Give me an example.
Where do you live? What's your name? Where do you work?
Press for Truth, Dan Dix.
He's an independent journalist. No, he's not.
Yeah, you guys can leave me alone.
No, he's not. Do not touch me again.
Go off that way. You're going to walk to the end. You can walk the rest manager, sir.
All right.
We can walk you right out, sir.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere,
No,
dude.
watch me. You're going to be going somewhere, pal.
I'm on camera. I haven't touched you.
Confronted by the immediacy of the threat and impossibility to reason with the crowd, a crowd of people who not only refused to cite any evidence of the crimes of which they accused him, but a gang a fanatical rabble that parroted uninformed accusations and epithets, Dan eventually placed himself near a police officer on the public sidewalk, and not only received no aid, but was singled out by the officer to leave because, the cops said, it was Dan, by being present in that public space, who was the disruptive element.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but you know what? That's a good way out, right? I'm not going out, though. Huh? Why would I go out?
Get out of here, you Nazi piece of shit.
How do you figure I'm a Nazi? What have I done or said?
He's not touching you. He's not.
What do you mean I'm not supporting it? What have I ever said or done that makes you think I'm a Nazi? What have you got? What have I said or done? Why?
Hey, he's not touching. You don't need to touch me. How about we step away?
Hey! All right, they're getting violent against me now.
A few days later,
Willingly being exited by the police. I'm being forcefully removed by the police now.
it was Dan whom the police arrested. Not the threatening, shrieking, misinformed, and aggressive mob, but the innocent man who was simply asking questions.
So guys, I'm surrounded by hundreds of people who think I'm a racist. Guys, please share this stream. This is crazy.
What do you want to say to all the people here?
Well, it's the same thing. I've been asking them, like, what makes you feel this way? And nobody can say anything because they don't know who I am. It's all mob mentality, mob thing, group mentality.
And so one sees Vancouver, supposed civilization, and one of many places where one can witness the madness of crowds. As an innocent, peaceful man is surrounded by a growing cluster of ignorant, self-congratulatory, maniacal aggressors bent on overwhelming him and breaking his will.
Okay, have you made your statement? I'm not here to make a statement. These people just surrounded me out of nowhere.
No, but I think you're, like, obviously, you're the different voice right now, right?
I'm the what?
You seem to be the different voice. You seem to have caused the group a little bit of concern. Is that fair?
Unfounded. They don't know me.
For all its surrealist, truth-telling commentary, Dan's plight could have been that of number 6 in The Prisoner.
We are bound to classify you as unmutual. We must warn you that if any further complaint is lodged against you, it will be necessary to propose you for the treatment known as instant social conversion.
Unmutualism number 6. More, you must now agree, than just a game.
They are socially conscious citizens and are provoked by the loathsome presence of an unmutual.
They are sheep.
Of course, it doesn't take references to Nazi Germany or to FDR's internment of innocent people or to one of the greatest television creations so far to observe that this shameful madness has been seen and dissected before. In fact, in 1895, Gustave le Bon wrote what might be his most famous book on the topic. It was searing, it was insightful, it was frightening, and it was called simply The Crowd.
The most attentive observation of the facts of history has invariably demonstrated to me that social organisms being every whit as complicated as those of all beings, it is in no wise in our power to force them to undergo on a sudden far-reaching transformations. Nature has recourse at times to radical measures, but never after our fashion, which explains how it is that nothing is more fatal to a people than the mania for great reforms, however excellent these reforms may appear theoretically.
Le Bon's observations are, on the whole, correct and darkly prescient. But what if this madness of crowds is more than it appears? More than an unavoidable outgrowth of groups? More than cinematic images of people ganging up to single out and attack an individual or smaller group? Are men who gather together always fated to fall into some moral collapse? Dive into an abyssal troglodytic state that sees their base instincts and dark passions poison their souls? If so, why aren't malls constantly chaotic? Why don't poker games consistently turn into lynch mobs? Why are music festivals some of the biggest money makers each summer? And how is it that all these people can gather in large numbers and somehow respect one another? Indeed, how is it that they respect and prosper? Perhaps this indicates that the traditional view of the madness of crowds requires magnification and deeper questions that can help us understand the real madness and avoid the attacks. And perhaps those factors shed light on something more profound, that the madness is of a different sort than most are willing to explore. Indeed, what if the madness of crowds is the madness of something else? What if the madness of crowds is not really the madness of crowds at all, but the madness of the political collective? What if, in fact, it is the hidden heart of the state, from monarchy to oligarchy to socialism to so-called republic to democracy, which is really just socialism wearing makeup, and the tendency of the state to destroy individual identity and responsibility that gives rise to this madness? To test this hypothesis, one must first define the political collective, the polis, aka the state. The polis is any agency of coercion, illegitimately, without true consent, staking the sole claim on the use of aggressive violence. From this precept, one can begin understanding the madness of crowds, i.e., the collective, by exploring the perverse effects the state has on human ethics and interaction wherever the state shows its influence, and by investigating how and to what degree the state incentivizes or penalizes violence in those areas. This allows comparison to what is found in similar investigations of how those factors are affected by direct human interaction and real interpersonal ethics. The state's perverse effects on human ethics are manifold, ranging from a mistaken belief that, in some magical way, governance by the polis is self-governance.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it.
To the erroneous idea that the state represents the so-called will of the people, by the way, something Jean-Jacques Rousseau labeled the general will, even as he forbade individual wills to reveal real preferences, to the idea that the state can reflect the care or interests of anyone it governs, when in fact, individual volition is necessary to indicate real views. But while they all contribute to the madness of crowds witnessed on the streets of Vancouver and elsewhere, and to the madness of collectivism in general, it is two unavoidable consequences of the state, the tragedy of the commons and moral hazard, that shed the brightest light on the problem and allow true understanding of the overall lessons. The tragedy of the commons can be discussed with easy facility and occurs when private property ownership and control are suppressed or eliminated by the state, and the state forces people to pay for public property. Each person being taxed could feel that he or she has a justified claim over how the government-run property is run. But not everyone can have his or her desires fulfilled, thus creating division and conflict. Does it sound familiar? The public streets are a perfect example of the tragedy of the commons, be they conflict inducers because people with different political ideas want to march on them,
What is to my bullshit.
I don't sleep.
Or be they sources of conflict because the state throws good and bad drivers with different reasons for being on the roads onto the same roads.
From the east, and here there's just too much traffic being pumped into the pipe, and we'd see this kind of traffic pattern here every Friday.
Right, too many cars and lorries, not enough tarmac.
If one is looking for a way to inspire anger and violence, whether in the form of road rage or protesters singling out the nonconformists for being on their street, as they might think, the government-run roads are a classic example and a microcosm of the larger problem of the state common itself. And roads are also an excellent way to shift into the second major driver of property destruction and direct attacks against individuals, the moral hazard of the state. As we previously have explored, a moral hazard is an environment in which some outside agent, usually the state, warps the incentives and disincentives for and the consequences of certain actions. Through subsidies, bailouts, below-market loans, protection against competition, and other forms of intervention, agents of the state suppress individual culpability and responsibility, leading to reckless behavior and profligate spending on the part of the recipients. Meanwhile, those who risk their own capital or are directly tied to decisions through actual voluntary contract with others are much more responsible for their actions, and they bear the burden of their own mistakes, especially if they bring harm to the property or lives of others. Thus, it's easy to see that, for example, if people asking for and gaining admission to a private roadway or a mall end up inflicting harm on the property of the owner, they will be cited for being directly responsible. There's an incentive for both the property owner and the visitor to guard his decisions and actions carefully. Any lack of response will see further arbitration and potential exclusion by the property owner or other owners. Too heavy a policing hand on the part of the owner will create a bad reputation and loss of income. But the state not only has a difficult time excluding potentially risky users, it has no real incentive to do so or to police the allowed uses properly, either to the satisfaction of property owners or the users on the street. The state simply can call on more money in the form of taxes, or print more money, or issue bonds that will renew the cycle and kick the can further down the proverbial currency control and taxation road. And this lack of direct feedback and penalties for both the government operator of the street and the potential protester act as moral hazards, true moral hazards, in the form of user desensitization to the consequences of his or her own actions and a tendency to mix this with the combative nature of the tragedy of the commons. An incendiary mix is the result, a mix that is made even more dangerous by another facet of the moral hazard of the state, that being the fact that the state itself is portrayed by politicians as a sort of ethical bellwether that reflects the morals of all the people therein. Of course, it is anything but. In fact, the moral hazard nature of the state is such that, as we see, it incentivizes reckless behavior in a more perverse way through the voters themselves, who are not directly connected to the consequences of their actions. And it discourages individual care for others, even as it replaces this care with a pseudo-bureaucratic, faceless welfare system that is much more prone to operating according to rhetoric and falsehood than actual verifiable results.
Infraction of federal regulations controlling dispensation of medication at auto drugstores. It says here you've begun voluntary treatment with Dr. William Haber, correct?
Yes.
You've surrendered your pharmacy card to the authorities?
Yes. Only I have a prescription from Dr. Haber. Have it back here. Here it is.
All right. I'll have to issue you a temporary pharmacy card. But don't abuse it. As is your right, if you have any complaints, Here's an HEW-approved list of public investigators.
In fact, as the Public Choice School of Economics has shown, the state creates a system where real, concrete feedback for the average voter is virtually non-existent and comes mostly in the form of a diffuse message, emotion, or belief system that allows people to feel comfortable. The narrative as evidence, rather than real evidence.
We're gonna spread happiness. We're gonna spread freedom. Obama's gonna change it. Obama's gonna lead.
프로브리겨는 미국의 행위를 강력히 규탄했습니다. 기자회견에서 발언자들은 미국이
Protests turned destructive in downtown Seattle tonight. Here's what we know as of 10 o'clock.
Equal justice under the law. We're going to come in, write a letter, and if they don't change, we're going to put a tariff on their cars until they change.
I believe in the Second Amendment. It's there written on the paper.
In fact, those who vote operate according to a different set of incentives than those who directly participate in the market. Voters rarely, if ever, feel the direct consequences of their actions. Just like the marchers on the street who riot and loot, the chances are low that voters will ever be made aware of or held liable for making bad choices, for licensing the state to take other people's lives or property, or ordering others around, all done via the machine of their vote and the violent mechanism of the polis. And because they do not see or feel the direct consequences of their own actions, voters are prone to respond to rhetoric and slogans, to misdirection and groupthink. The state hides or absolves them of their predation.
Hey folks, I'm Joe Biden. I'd like to ask you to join my campaign.
And the larger the group, the less responsible they will be. Likewise, if one were alone on the streets of Vancouver, it would be much more difficult to feel morally or ethically superior to Dan Dix and aggressively drive him away from his peaceful presence on the street. It would be much more difficult than it is when one is supported by 50 or 100 or 1,000 people operating under the illusion that such an action is part of a great crusade against evil, a crusade that relies on the state to offer a comforting narrative or positive change. But superior numbers do not make superior ethics. And the state is not in any way a magical giver of absolution. If an act is bad for one to perpetrate, then it is made no more ethical for 50 or 1,000 or 50,000 to perpetrate. The problem is that the state makes it easier. It creates the moral hazard of disconnecting people from their actions through the vote in the virtual public space, and it promulgates a religious fervor. The voter is ignorant of the consequences or absolved through this religious mentality that hides the victim and concentrates on the majority or some large or popular group. This is a grave danger and sees the kind of fervent drive to alienate and castigate that lone dissenter in Vancouver.
Settle down.
They just attacked me.
Let's go.
All right, guys.
Put the cameras down, guys. I'm telling you right now, turn the cameras off.
Yeah, I can't do that.
Yes, I can, because you're under arrest right now.
Why am I under arrest?
I didn't like the for what?
For your protection. Yes. Yes. You're going to break my hand, dude. Easy. You weren't listening and ready to what you want. Doesn't attack me, dude.
Stop filming. What do you mean I'm not listening? I said
put this in your bag. We're leaving. Okay.
Or to excuse looting by creating a narrative about exploitation and systemic violence, when in fact the looters and rioters mostly are in favor of further state exploitation or state-run systemic violence to somehow, they claim, rectify prior wrongs that might never have been committed by those they seek to victimize.
Somebody threw it back. I think that was a can.
Coupled with the deference to so-called authority, as witnessed in the horrifying command and control experiments of Stanley Milgram at Yale in the 1960s.
Volunteers were told they were taking part in scientific research to improve memory.
Would you open those and tell me which of you is which, please? Teacher. Where? Teacher.
Separated by a screen, the teacher would ask the learner questions in a word game and administer an electric shock when the answer was incorrect. He was told to increase the voltage with each wrong answer.
Cloud. Horse. Rock. House. Answer. Wrong. 150 volts. Answer. Horse.
Oh. Experiment. That's all. Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please.
Continue, please. Go right on.
I refuse to go on. Let me out.
You refuse to go on? The experiment requires you continue, teacher. Please continue.
Participants didn't know that the learner was really an actor and the so-called shocks harmless.
You're going to get a shock. 180 volts.
Oh. I can't stand the pain. Let me out of here.
Can't stand it. I'm not going to kill that man today. I mean, who's going to take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman? I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please. All right, next one, slow. Walk, dance, truck, music.
Two-thirds of volunteers were prepared to administer a potentially fatal electric shock when encouraged to do so by what they perceived as a legitimate authority figure. In this case, a man in a white coat.
The testimony of Nazi soldiers tried for war crimes who said they were merely following orders as they rounded up disarmed civilians to be slaughtered like cattle.
The prosecution uses the fact that I was the second man of the state as proof that I must have known everything that happened. But it does not present any documentary or other convincing proof in cases why I have denied under oath that I knew about certain things, much less desired them. Therefore, it's only an allegation and a conjecture when the prosecution says, who should have known that, if not Göring, who was the successor of the Führer? No state ever gave notice to the Reich at the proper time, pointing out that any activity for National Socialism would be made subject to punishment and persecution. On the other hand, if we, the leaders as individuals, are called to account and condemned, very well. But you cannot punish the German people at the same time. The German people placed their trust in the Führer, and under his authoritarian government, they had no influence on events.
And the torture programs of the Bush and Obama administrations, this so-called group mind, subsumes individual will and individual moral culpability beneath a greater will or noble purpose that, again, is disconnected from real consequences of one's own error or wrongdoing. Rousseau would be proud. The noble purpose, the authority figure or command structure or collective good tied to emotion triggers such as equality of outcomes, so-called social justice, all to be achieved via the corrupt machine of the state, thus making it anything but really social, because the veil through which the crowd sees the world is provided to them not through individual choice, but through the collective. Thus, from the French Revolution, beginning with Rousseau's jealousy-pushing discourse on inequality, in which he claimed the root of all inequality was the human devotion to private property, by the way, he being a man who fathered 5 children, sent them all to the state foundlings' home, then blamed society for not being able to, as he said, quote, feel the warmth of a father's embrace, end quote, of his kids. To the scapegoating of Jewish people in Germany since They, of course, engaged in banking because they didn't conform to the New Testament and its perceived dislike of money interest, often called usury, but which is actually something quite different. To the internment of Japanese Americans in World War II to today, that dark splinter of the soul, that tendency to push political collectivism despite being ignorant of details, but being buoyed by emotionalism, group bias reinforcement, and the Aristotelian fallacy of the appeal to authority, doesn't just lead to the madness of crowds. It is the madness. The state is the madness, and its collectivization, its push to make everything a consideration and a matter for the concern of the crowd, has been utilized by very dark minds, all through their unwitting accomplices in the crowds, as they're called. And all of it has been amplified by the unalterable fact that the government has invaded private life to such an extent few people in the West can distinguish between society and the state. Few are aware of the fact that when people feel direct one-on-one responses to their actions, they adjust and accommodate better, and that when matters are collectivized, people are much more willing to act without regard to the consequences, which is precisely what people like Rousseau and more contemporary dark plotters had hoped they could use to their advantage to increase the power of the state. So how do ethical people fight this? The guiding principles, the rules of thumb to distinguish mad crowds from those that are intent on peace, are the same ethical rules that apply to all human interpersonal activity. First, does the stated goal of the gathering accord with the moral principle of non-aggression? Does it respect individual sovereignty and private property? Or is there behind the so-called reform a call for an infringement of someone else's rights? If the latter, the gathering is nothing better than a violent mob intent on looting, whether that looting manifests itself on the street that moment or through the vote, through the state, it is all a distinction without a difference. This mob is no different than any form of the state, for all states exist only through the forced expropriation of property money and the immoral, unethical assumption that whoever runs the state can employ aggressive violence against others and attack their rights. If, on the other hand, the crowd is gathered to support individual rights, distinguishes between the state and private initiative and private property, and is calling for a real decrease in government controls and aggression rather than for a shift or increase in said controls, then the likelihood of private property damage and personal aggression at such gatherings is low. If the gathering is on private property, the likelihood is even lower. And it is important to remember that this principle about gatherings or crowds that come together to respect private property and individual liberty does not translate to states that we are told respect private property. There is no state that respects private property, just states that infringe on private property and liberty to different degrees. And it is at best self-delusional to think that one can appeal to the state, which only exists by taking property and attacking liberty, to protect property and liberty. More often than not, such a belief is deadly and feeds into mass violence. Precisely what we see on the streets today. The madness of the crowd. The madness of the political collective. No individual culpability, no direct tie to the effects of one's actions. No morals, no soul. Be careful when pushing for the political collective, because it has no soul and brings nothing but aggression and destruction. Thank you very much for watching. Please visit us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Hit the bell for notifications. Please visit us on BitChute. We would love to see you there. We're under Liberty Conspiracy at both sites. And of course, you can find us on Facebook while they still allow us to exist under Liberty Conspiracy. Be seeing you.
This is Dan Dix here, reporting for Press for Truth, and if you've been following my work over the last few weeks, you'll know that tensions have been escalating surrounding my coverage of various events. So today, we're going to talk about the left, we're going to talk about the right, and we're going to talk about the clashes that have been happening in between on a global level. But just before we do, I'll remind you that I am being financially attacked right now as GoFundMe has kowtowed to the mob and terminated my campaign. So in true free market style, I found another company that isn't removing me, which is called Go Get Funding. So if you appreciate my efforts to bring you this information, please check the links in the description below to find out how you can contribute to this campaign, Dan Dix assaulted and arrested, then attacked financially. Any and all contributions are very greatly appreciated. Alright, so the death of George Floyd, as you know, has sparked widespread anger all over the globe, which has caused Black Lives Matter and anti-police brutality rallies to pop up and start fighting for injustice. I've made documentary films about Canada's police state, so in terms of coverage, this is right up my alley. But as you may have seen, I was singled out, surrounded by a mob who were all claiming that I was a Nazi and a white supremacist, and I was eventually assaulted, which caused the police to arrest me for an alleged breach of the peace and assault.